This wasn't something you went looking for. It entered your life quietly, but it stayed in your awareness longer than it should have. Not loud, not obvious, just persistent enough that you couldn't ignore it. There's a reason for that. Some people pass through your life and leave nothing behind. But this one didn't pass. It registered. It held your attention in a way that doesn't happen without cause. You noticed things you weren't trying to notice. You felt something you weren't trying to feel. And even when you stepped back, it didn't fully leave your mind. That's not a coincidence. That's placement. You weren't brought into her life to be another presence in the background. You were brought in because you can recognize what others overlook and respond in a way most people can't. This is not about emotion. This is about purpose. One, you were placed where others couldn't be useful. Not every presence creates impact. Many people enter someone's life, say the right things, show concern, and still leave without changing anything beneath the surface. Their involvement stays limited to what can be seen and responded to easily. They react to expressions, to words, to visible behavior, and because of that, their role remains within a range that doesn't reach deeper layers. Your presence did not operate at that level. You didn't come in trying to fix anything. You didn't arrive with a plan or with the intention to become important. In fact, nothing about your entry felt significant at first. It was quiet, almost ordinary. But what made it different was not how it looked. It was what you could recognize once you were there. You noticed things that were not directly shown. Not in an analytical way, not by trying to figure something out, but in a way that felt immediate. A shift in tone, a pause in response. Something that didn't fully align with what was being said. These details are easy to overlook because they don't demand attention. Most people move past them and continue interacting on the surface. You didn't. Your awareness stayed with those details, not because you were searching, but because something in you naturally registered them, and that ability changed the role you played without you needing to define it. This is where usefulness becomes different from simple presence. Being around someone is not the same as being able to reach what actually matters in their situation. Many people can offer support, advice, or attention, but if they are only responding to what is visible, they remain limited in what they can affect. They engage with the surface and leave the deeper layer untouched. You were not operating from the surface. What you responded to was not fully expressed. It didn't come in clear words or direct signals. It existed in what was not being said, in what was being held back, in what remained unaddressed. And because you could recognize that, your presence aligned with something others could not reach. That is why your role could not be replaced easily. Others may have been around her, may have interacted with her more frequently, may have said more or done more, but usefulness is not measured by quantity, it is measured by alignment. It is about whether someone is able to meet the situation at the level it actually exists. And you did that without forcing it. You didn't need to step forward or make your presence larger than it was. You didn't need to prove that you understood anything. The alignment was already there, and because of that, even a small interaction carried weight. This is what makes placement different from coincidence. You were not there to fill space. You were there because the situation required a certain kind of awareness, a certain kind of steadiness, something that does not come from reacting quickly or trying to control what is happening. It required someone who could remain grounded, notice without interfering, and respond without adding pressure. And that is exactly where you fit. You didn't create the role, you met it, and that is why your presence mattered in a way that was not obvious on the outside, but significant where it actually counted. 2. You felt the shift before you understood it. Not everything is understood first and felt later. Some things arrive the other way around. There is a change in the atmosphere, a subtle difference in how something moves, and before your mind can explain it, Your awareness has already registered that something is not the same as it was before. It doesn't come with clear language or a defined reason. It comes as a quiet sense that something has shifted. That is what happened here. You didn't begin with analysis. You didn't sit and try to figure out what was going on or why it mattered. The recognition came before any explanation. There was a slight tension where there should have been ease, a pause where there should have been flow, a feeling that something was not fully aligned, even though nothing obvious pointed to it. Most people ignore that. They wait for something clear, something that can be explained directly, something that fits into words. If it cannot be defined quickly, they move past it and continue as usual. But what you noticed didn't come in a form that demanded attention. It required sensitivity, the ability to stay with a feeling without needing to label it immediately. You stayed with it, not in a way that made you overthink, but in a way that allowed the awareness to remain present. You didn't rush to define it, and because of that, you didn't override it with assumptions. You allowed the signal to exist without forcing it into a conclusion, and that gave you access to something more accurate than a quick interpretation would have provided. This is where your response began to differ. Instead of reacting based on incomplete understanding, you moved with awareness that was still forming. You adjusted without needing full clarity. You responded carefully, not because you were uncertain, but because you recognized that what you were sensing had not yet revealed itself completely. This kind of awareness is not common. It requires restraint. It requires the ability to trust what you notice without needing immediate proof. And it requires patience to allow something to unfold before deciding what it means. Most people move too quickly to conclusions, and in doing so, they miss what was present before it became obvious. You did not miss it. You felt the shift early, before it could be clearly explained. And because you felt it early, your presence adjusted in a way that remained aligned with what was actually happening, not just with what was visible. From the outside, nothing may have looked different. The interaction may have seemed normal. But internally, your position had already changed. You were no longer engaging from the same level as before. You were responding to something deeper, something that had not yet surfaced fully. This is what makes your role precise. You didn't wait for the situation to become clear to everyone. You were already aware of the direction it was moving in. And because of that, your actions, your tone, your level of involvement all shifted naturally without needing to be explained. That early awareness is what allowed you to move correctly within the moment. Not by reacting to what was obvious, but by responding to what was already changing beneath it. And by the time others could begin to notice something was different, you had already adjusted. You felt it before it became clear. And that is what kept your presence aligned with what actually needed to happen. 3. Your calm changes her internal state. Calm is often misunderstood as silence or lack of reaction, but it is something much more active than that. It is a steady internal position that does not shift easily based on what is happening around it. When someone carries that kind of calm, it affects the environment without needing to say much. It changes how situations move, how tension settles, and how others begin to respond without fully realizing why. That is what your presence brought into her space. You didn't try to control anything. You didn't attempt to fix what was happening or guide it in a certain direction. But the way you remained grounded created a different atmosphere. Your responses were not rushed. Your tone did not carry pressure. Your presence did not add to the confusion or intensity that may have already been there. And that difference mattered. When someone is used to reacting quickly or carrying internal tension, they often move based on that same energy. Their thoughts become faster, their emotions become heavier, and their behavior begins to follow that pattern. Most interactions only reinforce that state because people respond with equal intensity or try to counter it in ways that create more pressure. You did not do that. You stayed steady. Not in a distant way, and not in a way that ignored what was happening, but in a way that did not mirror the instability around you. Your calm was not dependent on her state, and because of that, it introduced something new into the interaction. That new presence creates space. When someone is around a steady energy, even briefly, it begins to interrupt the internal movement they are used to. Their thoughts slow down without being forced. Their reactions soften without needing to be corrected. They begin to feel a different pace, a different way of existing in that moment. This shift is subtle, but it is real. You may not have seen it directly, she may not have expressed it clearly, but internally, something adjusts when a different kind of energy enters the space. Not because it is imposed, but because it is stable enough to influence without effort. Your calm did not demand anything from her. It did not require her to change or respond in a certain way. It simply existed, and that allowed her internal state to begin adjusting on its own. The pressure she may have been carrying did not need to be explained for it to soften. The tension did not need to be addressed directly for it to reduce. That is the effect of real steadiness. It does not force change, it allows change. Most people try to create impact by doing more, saying more, or reacting more strongly. But true impact often comes from not adding to what is already unstable. It comes from holding a position that remains unchanged, even when everything else is shifting. You held that position, and because of that, your presence reached a level that words alone could not reach. It influenced her internal state without needing to explain anything, without needing to direct anything, and without needing to stay longer than necessary. This is why your role matters in a way that is not always visible. You were not there to create noise or to take control of the situation. You were there to introduce something stable into a space that needed it. And once that stability is experienced, even briefly, it leaves an effect that does not disappear immediately. Because calm, when it is real, does not just remain with you. It transfers. And that transfer is what begins to change things from the inside. 4. You are not meant to carry what isn't yours. When you can sense what others are going through, it becomes easy to step into a role that was never assigned to you directly. You notice the tension, the confusion, the parts that are not being expressed clearly, and without being asked, you begin to hold space for it. At first, it feels natural. It feels like awareness, like understanding, like being present in a way that others are not. But over time, that awareness can quietly turn into responsibility, and that is where the shift needs to be recognized. You were able to see what others overlooked. You were able to feel what was not being said. But seeing something clearly does not mean you are meant to carry it. There is a difference between recognizing a situation and becoming responsible for it. That difference is subtle, and it is easy to miss because it does not happen all at once. It builds slowly. You stay a little longer than needed. You think about it more than required. You begin to adjust your own energy in response to something that is not yours to manage. And without noticing, your awareness turns into involvement. That is where boundaries begin to blur. You start to feel like your presence should solve something. That if you remain steady enough, respond carefully enough, or stay engaged long enough, something will shift completely. And while your presence can influence a moment, it is not meant to take ownership of what belongs to someone else's process. What she is going through is real. What you noticed is real. But it is not yours to fix, carry, or resolve. Your role was to show up with clarity, not to absorb what she is holding. It was to remain grounded, not to take on the weight of what is unresolved in her. And this distinction is important, because without it, you begin to move out of alignment with yourself. Carrying what isn't yours creates imbalance. It pulls your attention away from your own center and places it into something that does not belong to your path. You start thinking in ways that are not natural to you. You begin to feel a sense of pressure that was never yours to begin with. And even if your intentions are right, the direction becomes unclear, because you are now operating from involvement instead of awareness. Awareness keeps you steady. Involvement pulls you in. You were not placed there to take over her process. You were not meant to become the one who holds everything together. You were there to recognize, to respond in a way that does not create more instability, and to allow what needs to unfold without interference. This is where restraint becomes important. Not everything you see needs to be addressed. Not everything you feel needs to be acted on. Sometimes the most accurate response is to remain present without stepping further in, to allow space without trying to fill it, to observe without turning that observation into action. That is not detachment. That is control. It is the ability to stay aligned with your role without extending beyond it. Because once you begin to carry what is not yours, you lose clarity in your own position. You begin to move based on what someone else is experiencing rather than what is actually required from you. And that changes the entire dynamic. Your strength in that moment came from your steadiness, from your ability to remain grounded without becoming entangled in what was happening. That is what allowed your presence to have an effect. But that effect only remains accurate when you do not overstep into something that was never yours to manage. You are not there to complete her process. You are not there to remove her confusion, to carry her emotional weight, or to guide every step she takes. Those are parts of her own path, and they cannot be transferred to you, no matter how clearly you can see them. What you can do is remain aligned with yourself, to stay aware without absorbing, to stay present without attaching, to respond when it is necessary, and to step back when it is not. And most importantly, to recognize that your role has limits, not because you lack the ability to do more, but because doing more is not what is required. There is a point where awareness must stop turning into action, and that point is where you maintain control over your own energy, where you allow things to exist without needing to carry them forward, where you trust that what is not yours will continue without your involvement. That is where clarity stays intact. Because the moment you begin to carry what isn't yours, you step out of the position that made your presence effective in the first place. You move from precision into overextension, from alignment into imbalance. You were placed to recognize, not to absorb. You were positioned to respond correctly, not to take responsibility for what belongs to someone else. And once you understand that clearly, your presence remains clean, controlled, and accurate, because you are no longer trying to hold what was never yours to carry. 5. The right move is not always immediate. There is a natural urge to respond quickly when something feels important. When you notice a shift, when you sense that something matters, the instinct is to act, to say something, to step forward and do what feels right in that moment. It creates a sense of control, as if movement itself is the correct response. But not every situation requires immediacy, and not every accurate action is meant to happen right away. What you are dealing with here does not operate on speed. It operates on timing. There is a difference between reacting because something feels urgent and responding because the moment is actually ready. Urgency often comes from internal pressure, from the feeling that if you don't act now, something will be lost or missed. But clarity does not rush. It remains steady, and it moves only when the conditions are aligned. You may have felt that pull to act, to clarify something, to step in more directly, to move the situation forward in a way that feels resolved. But that pull does not always mean action is required. Sometimes it is simply the mind trying to complete something before it has fully revealed itself. When something is still forming, immediate action can distort it. You may step in too early, before you have full clarity. You may respond based on what you think is happening rather than what is actually there. And in doing so, you can shift the direction of something that needed more space to unfold naturally. This is where patience becomes part of precision, not passive waiting, and not hesitation, but controlled stillness. The ability to stay aware without needing to move right away. The ability to hold your position without forcing a response just to reduce uncertainty. Most people struggle with this. They feel something, and they act on it immediately. They try to resolve, define, or complete the situation as quickly as possible, because staying in an open state feels uncomfortable. But that discomfort is often part of the process. It is what allows things to develop in a way that is accurate rather than rushed. You are not meant to react to every signal you receive. Some signals are meant to be observed, not acted on. Some moments are meant to pass without intervention, because intervening too early would change something that is still aligning itself. This does not mean you ignore what you notice. It means you respect the timing of it. There is a point where action becomes clear, a point where you no longer feel the need to question whether to move or not. That clarity does not come from forcing a decision. It comes from allowing enough space for the situation to show itself fully. Until that point, stillness is not inactivity. It is control. It is the ability to remain present without interfering, to maintain your awareness without turning it into premature action. And that control is what keeps your role accurate within the situation. If you move too early, you risk stepping outside of what is actually needed. You may bring clarity where silence was required. You may introduce direction where openness was necessary. You may try to resolve something that was not ready to be resolved, and in doing so, you shift the balance that your presence was meant to maintain. But when you wait with awareness, something different happens. The situation begins to define itself more clearly. The uncertainty starts to settle into something that can be understood without guesswork. And when that happens, the next step becomes obvious, not because you forced it, but because it revealed itself. This is the difference between reaction and alignment. Reaction moves quickly but often lacks depth. Alignment moves at the right time and carries precision. It does not need to be rushed because it is not driven by pressure. Your role here is not to act as soon as you feel something. It is to recognize when action is actually required. And that recognition only comes when you allow enough space for clarity to form without interruption. You were not placed in that moment to fix it immediately. You were placed there to move correctly. And sometimes, moving correctly means not moving at all until the moment is ready. That is not hesitation. That is awareness operating at the right level. Because when the right move arrives, it does not feel forced. It feels obvious. And when something becomes obvious without pressure, you know it is aligned with what is actually needed, not just with what feels urgent in the moment. 6. This is about impact, not attachment. It is easy to confuse meaningful moments with something that needs to be held onto. When an interaction feels different, when it carries weight or leaves a lasting impression, the instinct is to stay connected to it, to keep it present, to extend it beyond the moment where it naturally existed. It can feel like something important should continue, as if letting it pass would reduce its value. But not everything meaningful is meant to be maintained. Some moments are designed to create an effect, not to become a permanent connection. They enter, shift something internally, and then move on without needing to stay attached to a longer outcome. And when that is misunderstood, attachment begins to form where it is not required. Your presence in her life was not about building something ongoing. It was about creating a change. That change may not be visible in a direct way. It may not show itself immediately, and it may not come with clear acknowledgement. But the effect of your presence exists in how something inside her shifted, even if that shift is subtle, even if it is still unfolding. Impact does not depend on duration. It does not require repeated interaction or continuous presence to remain valid. A short moment, if aligned correctly, can create a deeper effect than something that continues without direction. What matters is not how long you were there, but what changed because you were there. Attachment, on the other hand, shifts the focus. It begins to turn the moment into something that needs to be preserved. It creates a sense of holding on, of trying to maintain a connection beyond the point where it was naturally meant to exist. And when that happens, clarity begins to fade, because the intention is no longer aligned with the original purpose. You start to question what it means, what it should become, how it should continue. And in doing so, you move away from what actually mattered in the first place. The purpose of your presence was not to stay and build something ongoing. It was to introduce something that creates movement within her internal state. Something that changes how she sees, how she feels, or how she processes what she is going through. That kind of impact does not require you to remain involved. It requires you to show up correctly once. And once that is done, holding onto it does not increase its value. It only adds unnecessary weight to something that was meant to stay clean and precise. This is where discipline becomes important. The ability to recognize that something mattered without turning it into something you need to keep. The ability to step back without trying to extend what has already fulfilled its role. And the ability to remain clear about your position without letting emotion turn that clarity into attachment. You were not placed there to create dependency. You were not meant to become a constant presence or to fill a role that continues over time. You were there to create a shift. And once that shift begins, your role does not need to expand beyond that. In fact, trying to extend it can interfere with it. Because the moment you move from impact into attachment, your actions begin to carry a different intention. Instead of responding to what is needed, you begin responding to what you want to maintain. And that changes the entire dynamic. Impact is precise. It happens at the right moment, in the right way, without needing to repeat itself. It leaves something behind that continues without you having to stay connected to it. It is clean, controlled, and complete in its own form. Attachment is different. It seeks continuation. It looks for ways to hold on, to revisit, to keep something active even when its purpose has already been fulfilled. And in doing so, it can blur the clarity of what was originally correct. You are not meant to carry this forward as something ongoing. You are meant to recognize that what needed to happen has already begun. Your role was to show up with awareness, to respond without overstepping, and to allow that moment to create its effect without trying to control what happens next. And once that is done, stepping back is not a loss. It is completion, because the value of what you did is not measured by how long it continues. It is measured by the shift it created. And that shift does not depend on your continued presence. It exists because of the way you showed up in that moment. That is the difference. You were not there to stay connected. You were there to create impact. And once that impact is made, there is nothing left to hold on to. Only something that continues, without needing you to remain inside it. So, don't try to over-define this. You don't need to label it, explain it, or turn it into something bigger than what it already is. Because the moment you start forcing meaning, you lose clarity. You were placed in that moment with precision, not to control it, not to hold on to it, but to move through it the right way. What matters is not how it looks from the outside, but what shifts because you showed up the way you did. Stay aware, stay grounded, don't overstep what isn't yours. Because when you move with that level of control, even a small presence leaves a lasting impact. And that's the difference. You weren't there to stay. You were there to make it change.